Good morning or good afternoon, everyone, depending on where you're joining us from, and welcome to today's webinar. My name is Kyle from Business Review, and I'll be your host today. It's our pleasure to have NSF International with us, who's presenting this webinar entitled Executing Successful Remediation Program. T. Arendt, Executive Vice President at Health Sciences Consulting. I'd like to welcome you all to our webinar platform on 24. You'll notice that this webinar is browser-based. So if you disconnect for any reason, please just click the link you received via email to rejoin the session. If you want to ask any questions, you can send them in via the questions widget. Just type them into the box at the top left-hand corner of your screen, click submit, and we'll have some time at the very end to address any questions or thoughts that you may have. Please use the yellow help widget if you require any assistance, and you can move, resize, and maximize any of the windows in front of you to get a better view of the slides. But for now, please allow me to welcome Jesse Arendt. Over to you, Jesse.
Good morning, everyone. So I work with NSF International Health Sciences Group, and we are a leading consultancy with a global presence, and we provide expertise in a wide range of services for our clients, including auditing and inspections, regulatory affairs, training, quality management system oversight, and of course, our topic for today, which is remediation. In regards to this kind of work, we have performed both large and small programs around the world and have been a part of both updating and transforming companies through a close partnership in order to bring them from what's generally considered to be a very difficult position to one that is not only compliant, but focused on quality, with the ability to maintain their systems over the long term in a sustainable and yet efficient manner, such that after the remediation effort has been completed, they are able to remain within the parameters sought and expected by both their internal governance as well as the regulatory authorities. So I've been working in this field for more than 20 years, and I've had the privilege to partner with the whole gamut of large through small manufacturers, contract groups, packaging facilities, as well as directly with the regulators themselves. And as such, I've seen both the good and bad when it comes to evaluating and setting up remediation programs. I've performed hundreds of inspections myself around the globe, and I bring with that experience the knowledge and understanding of working with companies to understand the need to use such things as internal cultural change and communication to help drive the corrections needed to ensure successful remediation efforts can be realized. Today, we are going to discuss a few things over the next 30 minutes or so. First, we will set the stage for why a company needs to initiate a remediation program after a regulatory inspection and what the intended outcomes of any program is going to be and what it should be. We will also get into what should be considered prior to actually starting remediation work and what some of the key factors are to consider before you embark on the journey or take any actions at all. We will then move into what is one of the most critical parts of the process, which is to ensure that the objectives can actually be met, that it is sustainable, and that corrections put in place are appropriate for the issues at hand and will not either fall too short or, in some cases, actually become far too burdensome and unnecessary to accomplish the task. People ask me, why are we doing this? What are the goals for our program? So we will also unpack what I consider to be the primary goals of remediation work, so we can look for that. I'm then going to move into what we call the 3 C's here at NSF, which are critical success factors necessary for any remediation program through the whole process, starting with the initial alert all the way through final effectiveness checks. We will then move into some discussion on self-assessment from a fairly high level and questions that the organization can and should be asking themselves before embarking on this journey. And finally, I will follow that with a list of the top 6 most common stumbling blocks that I see commonly when companies attempt to drive changes, as well as what the overall remediation life cycle tends to look like for companies. So when we think about the reasons that a remediation is going to be necessary, there are a few different sources, but generally 2 that we're going to talk about today. The first is when you have identified the deficiency or risk on your own using currently established quality systems. This is certainly the better situation to be in because, firstly, it shows that your systems in place are actually functioning at a level that is, at the very least, sufficient to identify what those risks are and then escalate them in some kind of an appropriate manner. What is also good about this kind of remediation program is that it's not, and it will, at least it isn't generally, an immediate surprise or shock to the company. And time, which is precious, is generally in your favor. And finally, the ability to contain that or any response to within the company domain means that there are going to be less external pressures or stresses in regards to continual reporting to a regulatory body or to any other externally created timelines. The second source of a remediation, and the more primary point for our discussion today, is a deficiency that has been identified by an external source. And while this may include such things as supplier audits or customer audits, they're more generally linked to a regulatory inspection. Now, this is probably the most common reason that a remediation program is actually started. And it causes what I would consider to be the highest level of stress on a company, which can be understandable when they're potentially facing a long laundry list of observations that come with it the need to react with both great energy and purpose under predefined timelines. So this source will be the main topic today because it generally causes the most stress upon the people and the processes in place at any facility. And it requires immediate response, generally tight timelines, significant planning, people resources, financial resources, and of course management oversight, while at the same time likely not being within any pre-established budgetary line item or planned ahead of time as some kind of ongoing operational consideration. So what's going to happen next? Well, there are quite a few things that you're going to want to consider in the immediate aftershock of learning that remediation is actually required. First thing you want to do is just take a moment to assess the enormity and the gravity of the actual situation, both immediate as well as potentially long-term, depending on the scope of what those deviations actually were. And it's important not to simply read, for instance, a 483 observation word for word and then instantly jump to a conclusion for the path forward, which would prompt likely a reactionary approach that's not going to consider likely a whole host of things that need to be evaluated, both from a risk point of view. And here I always like to refer back to the guidance for ICH-Q9 for risk management to help drive priorities such as what that initial response is going to look like. Now, the problem that we see with industry time and time again is that when a management group looks through an inspection report, they oftentimes call for immediate action without sufficient strategy or planning, and this very likely is going to lead to failures in subsequent inspections for the very same issue, if not very similar issues. And this can quickly become a repetitive cycle of failure. It's a term I like to call chronic quality system noncompliance. And folks, folks in these positions generally have the very best intentions, but because they only scrape the surface and are being driven by potentially uninformed management choices, it can become a very difficult cycle to break. Now, from the management side, we need to ensure that they have fully bought into two things. Firstly, and this is really the main one, is that this is a very serious situation, which is going to require a large amount of their attention. And secondly, that they need to fully buy into whatever plan is being put together. It's not sufficient to simply inform the executive group about specific items for your plan, such as overall cost or overall timeline, and then walk away to execute. But they need to both understand what needs to be corrected and why, because there's generally an element of cultural change required for serious change action to be enacted and assimilated into the company. And this cultural shift will normally have a much higher likelihood of being successful if it's driven from the top down and embraced as the new paradigm going forward. If not, the business as usual model will generally be triumphant and change will be stymied. The various groups involved, when this happens, they may become fractured, with some trying to maintain the status quo while others push for change, and this can lead to a siloing effect within the remediation program itself. And as we have seen, here at NSF, there are some defined cycles for this buy-in, which can include initial denial of the problem itself, sometimes placing blame on what might be considered a poor inspector or perhaps an overzealous audit, rather than just accepting the situation as it is And from there through, moving into bargaining, perhaps for smaller changes or band-aid approaches that, again, generally lead to a cycle of continuous failure in subsequent inspections. Once we get past denial and eventually to acceptance, we need to quickly create a high-level strategy for the remediation program. What's it going to look like? Who's going to lead it? How long is it going to take? How much money is it going to cost? Is it going to interrupt fully the current business continuity, or will operations be able to continue concurrently? These are just a few of the items that need to be discussed amongst the management group as well as company leaders. Because at this point, the company is under pressure to meet required timeframes to respond to an objectionable observation. The company will, at this point, likely decide such things as, can we do this ourselves? Or perhaps should a contract with a consulting group that has remediation subject matter experts assist with both the response itself as well as strategy planning. It's for certain that a strategic, well-planned remediation is paramount to long-term sustainable corrections and corrective actions. This next part, in regard to primary versus secondary root cause, is important because you want to correct the problem itself and not merely the symptoms. A robust quality system provides an assurance of high-quality production efforts and products. And we at NSF recommend and have found that a system-based approach to remediation and corrective action is, simply put, the most successful approach. Not only that, but a systems-based approach is recognized globally with, for instance, both the MHRA and FDA supporting a systems-based model. Now, this is the point at which a review of your systems will be used in conjunction with your strategy and risk-based evaluation to ensure that the remediation program is not solely focused on just skimming the surface and assigning corrections to top-level issues without a review of the underlying supporting systems. For instance, let's think about one of the most common observations from FDA over the past few years, which is that investigations are not being performed in a thorough manner, or that they potentially don't reach root cause, and that they're found to be ineffective. Hence, they either have an overall high number of investigations, perhaps, or maybe they just have a very high rate of repeating deviations. At first glance, a remediation effort might simply perform a quick retraining of investigators and then just get back to work, or perhaps hire outside assistance to drive down a large number of open or overdue investigations. Now, this is likely to fail to actually solve the problem long-term in a sustainable manner. It sounds simple, but sometimes in the heat of a regulatory response, the underlying systems can get lost in the shuffle of that immediate action. But with the example above, you can likely easily see that quite a few underlying supportive systems are potentially being missed when you have such things as failure to have good investigations, such as a robust training evaluation, or have there been internal audits of GABA programs, as many corrective actions and measures require changes to, say, facilities or processes. Has there been a budget that's been supplied for these changes? Or if additional inspection programs have been created, have they actually been successful? And have processes been properly validated or revalidated after changes are made? And is your change control programming just actually functioning at an appropriate level, or has it really just become a paper exercise? These are just a few of the supporting systems that must be evaluated as part of the remediation before we jump in headlong. And assigning these priorities assigning priorities to these systems will begin to further mold the response and eventually action. So before we actually jump headlong at anything, let me just back up a little bit and pose a question. What is the goal for remediation? It seems like a simple question, right? We want to become compliant. Yes, of course. But that doesn't fully get us to where we want to be. Yes, we always certainly want to be in compliance to regulatory expectations. However, a company that just prides itself on only being compliant is, in my opinion, failing to capitalize on all the other business advantages of a robust quality system, where a fully functioning quality system will provide for an assurance that the products being manufactured are of high quality and integrity, and help to maintain a company also in a state of compliance. They are sometimes much more significant even than that. These quality systems also have impact on the company's business operating systems, which go directly to your business continuity. So again, what do we want the outcome of the remediation program to achieve? I would say that it's to transform the quality systems that are already in place to create operations that are in a constant state of inspection readiness, which generally, in turn, will both resolve the immediate concerns brought by a regulatory authority, as well as create a sustainable compliance program, all through quality. So we have done quite a bit of reflection and research on the remediation programs that we have managed and participated in here at NSF. And we've come to understand that a remediation plan that uses the points discussed thus far and can apply an effective strategy towards a system-based approach will further require what we like to call the 3 C's, which includes company culture, collaboration, and communication. There are certainly other success factors that go into remediation, but these 3, from a very high level, can really embody the process requirements. So think of these 3 concepts as all part of a 3-legged stool. While a team approach oftentimes will include communication and collaboration, the additional effort must be made, generally by the management group, to ensure that the value proposition and belief in the activities as they're being executed is passed down to all the divisions or the groups and the actual individuals that participate along the way. This is further made more critical if the target company is a global one and potentially has multiple facilities based around the world. As management group must lead by example to avoid these conflicts with the commitment to action versus what's probably established current behavior. When this conflict exists, it sends a very clear message to the rest of the organization that some behaviors are still being tolerated and sometimes even rewarded, even if they run contrary to the remediation strategy. But what do we mean really by culture or a culture of quality? Well, in my thought, it's basically that unseen desire and commitment to evaluate the organization and its processes, and then try to find ways to do business that's both more simple as well as more predictive. And when we bring quality to the business in this fashion, it's almost certain the compliance will fall into line alongside, which will lead to long-term successes rather than a picture of quality really that only exists in one singular moment. Now, it's well understood that the priorities that are pushed and the values that are reflected in the organization and the support systems and personnel that drive them will ultimately influence the manner in which the remediation activity is executed. Simply put, the concept of do what I do will go far in terms of success in these actions. When the management group is instead not in sync with the vision of the remediation plan and the principles of the solution, it becomes all that much more difficult to change behaviors of the supporting personnel. So if we want to succeed, we need to underpin the remediation program with a culture of quality that does not exist just on paper, but in actual practice every single day. And when the people who are working tirelessly to execute on a plan actually see that the management group is providing active support for a change in culture and behavior, that will generally facilitate forward progress. Now, one meaningful way that management can demonstrate their commitment to the program is to establish a steering committee or an executive oversight team. Regardless of the terminology, when we have a group in place that consists of many of the senior managers as well as executives meeting on a regular basis, it provides 3 important gains for the process. First, it allows for direct and frequent place to raise up any critical issues or roadblocks, and trust me, there will certainly be roadblocks along the way. And secondly, it allows for a regular meeting of managers that generally represent all the various functional areas of the company. And it provides them a place to get together and recap the activity between meetings to help alleviate any crossover concerns or pinch points or linkages that might impact multiple groups. And lastly, and most importantly in this case, it demonstrates that the executive group is really embedded in the program itself, and they're taking portions of time out of their day to commit to listening to and providing feedback on the process, which goes to both communication as well as culture. Now, when this all works out as it should, this is going to become the place where both the vision is set and we're providing resources as discussed and decisions are in fact being finalized. So how do we communicate, and how is that important to the remediation, you might be asking? Well, why not just have a single meeting, decide to throw some additional resources, for instance, let's say an investigations backlog, and just call it a day, right? It certainly seems simple enough. Well, unfortunately, communication in an organization is generally much more complex than that. And as a tool, communication needs to be well thought out, measured, planned, and continually managed over the duration in order to better assure the conveyance of key initiatives. And this, in turn, will provide for continued support of the program, as everyone will be on the same page in regards to the ongoing work, any direction, and any directional changes that, should they occur. And they certainly will occur over the overall life cycle. Remediation really is a living thing that's going to require change and modifications to either directions or goals throughout the process as the situation develops and more information is actually known. A simple communication program is really going to keep everybody from the top down on mission throughout, and having a common understanding of why these deviations or risks that have been identified are important to actually solve, why the proposed work is expected to facilitate these changes. We found over the years that formalizing a communications plan, either in some kind of a strategic planning document or part of a remediation playbook concept, is useful as it creates a written charter for how communication is going to be handled and how each role really is expected to participate, what each person's responsibilities are, and what the parameters have been established as for the structure of the overall program. So it might seem obvious that collaboration is going to be required to achieve a common goal, and yes, it is obvious. But what can happen is that initially teams are very gung-ho and everyone's passionate about the work at the very start. But as these programs wear on, the groups can become siloed and they stop collaborating with each other because it may sometimes seem more expeditious to just focus on your own portion of the work and not necessarily working within the other groups when challenges come up. And groups simply start passing challenges onto the downstream activities without understanding their own role in that overall cycle. Remediation activity is not normally a one-off, quick-to-complete activity. But if you look at the average, over time, that from when a company receives an actual inspection notification or perhaps a warning letter, it generally takes on average between 12 to 24 months to fully execute a successful program, which is a significant amount of time to be able to try and remain focused. And ensuring good collaboration between all the various groups involved over that length of time, while other operational and business activities are also usually ongoing, is in fact a known challenge. Collaboration will be essential to maintain not only focus, but the enthusiasm and continuity that's required over those long months. And while I do not want to say that remediation is only possible or successful when an outside consulting group is involved, the reality is that groups such as NSF are generally contracted to assist in these endeavors and sometimes even manage the remediation program itself. And this is simply due to the fact that they are complex undertakings and they require full-time and often overtime presence to fully manage the process. And this can burn out an organization's personnel if they do not have additional resources to lean on over time. But, and have to state, caution, really must be made when collaborating with an external consulting group. And that's because the organization wants to ensure that there really is a collaborative approach. And while a consulting group oftentimes will manage the work activity, the organization must remain in a hands-on position, such that even though execution of some of the work may be outsourced, that the organization is still driving the bus, so to speak, and remains actively involved in the decision-making progress. So thus, collaborating with an external resource rather than just, turning it over. And this serves, to reduce the risk of success to the program long term. Because at some point, when this consulting group moves away and the organization's, then going to be in a much better position to fully take the reins and keep moving forward with the understanding of what was changed, why, and how come. And essentially, this kind of healthy collaboration will allow for long-term ownership. There are, of course, other considerations that need to be addressed as a remediation plan and strategies being pulled together. I'll just run through a few of the more critical ones that come to mind. The first thing to consider really is your staff. And sometimes this kind of evaluation requires a high level of honesty, both from the person asking the questions as well as the people giving answers. Do we have the right staff to execute a remediation program? Do they have sufficient subject matter expertise? It can be quite common that, for instance, a QA manager or head of department, while perhaps very good at their role and is well positioned to execute the company's current systems, they may not be suited to become a change agent. And perhaps would an external resource be a good idea to partner with, those kinds of people to create the specific strategy for any number of corrective plans, of which there will likely be many. In my experience, actually running a successful remediation program can be exhausting, and putting the right person with the right personality and expertise in place is a critical choice. The role of a project manager in this case can very much feel like herding cats at times. And considering the number of moving parts, the competing priorities, having that person in place to be the calm presence who has the finger on the pulse of all of the different initiatives is a brilliant way to maintain order and progress. Sometimes we ask, do key members of the staff, regardless of their expertise, have any bandwidth to execute something as critical as this new work? And if they don't, what are the other programs or initiatives that can be put on hold for potentially 12 plus months? And lastly, a word on education and training. It's almost a certainty that there's going to be a need to elevate the expertise and comfort level of your internal staff, either along the way or after the work is done, in order to maintain the sustainability of the programs long term. The management group should be considering along the way what kind of training they need to provide, both internally to reset expectations and change behaviors, but also from a development point of view. How can they use external, potentially training programs to better educate their supervisors on regulatory expectations or perhaps best practice? There are a whole host of ways to provide this kind of educational exposure for your teams across the board. This not only allows them to grow as employees, but puts them in a better position to maintain vigilance on your newly created quality systems. And some of these training programs are ones that we at NSF also utilize, and programs that include such things as quality planning, auditing and risk assessments, investigation methods, and CAPA execution, as well as simplification of operations and processes. Such as how are SOPs put together, and what are the document controls, and ensuring that they've been executed and set up to ensure simplicity. What might be considered some of the other stumbling blocks that you need to think about when you're planning for a large-scale remediation program? Well, we've already discussed taking a systems-based approach, which will help avoid tunnel vision and a narrow focus in regards to the response work. Taking a reactionary knee-jerk response approach is also likely destined to cause not just trouble, but it creates a superficial program that does not generally address true root causes, which is really where you need to get to. Another area that's a constant struggle for organizations is the question of whether operations will continue as planned during the ongoing remediation program. Now, this might be decided for you, depending on the severity of the notification, of course. But in other cases, the symptoms may be found to have taken root in sufficient systems that it requires many, if not all, of the production to cease until some later point, or as the risk-based approach would allow for other things to begin restarting operations. Now, these are worst-case scenarios, of course, and while they happen regularly, it is, of course, possible, depending on the types of deficiencies discovered, it's possible to maintain your production in some fashion or another. While this may ease some of the revenue concerns that organizations struggle with constantly, it can sometimes muddle the waters when it comes to setting priorities and assigning resources. So, simply put, when these decisions are being made, we need to make sure that all points of view are being addressed and discussed. There's no larger risk to a sustainable program than to underestimate the need for education and re-education efforts. This will drive the behavior, or it's going to drive the change of behavior home initially, and in the long term, as well. And it simply should not be overlooked as a paper exercise, but should be paired with an appropriate subject matter expert to ensure understanding and what the criticality of those change processes really are. Now, let's consider the bigger picture of what a normal life cycle will look like for a remediation program. Some of this we've touched on, but to bring it all together, we start with the discovery of the issue itself, whether it's internal or external. That's going to remain the initial discovery. This can be difficult news sometimes, and the presentation of this to a room full of people should really be handled carefully and with as little bias as possible. And certainly, it's not a place to lay blame at any point. Now, if the news of a major deficiency is a surprise, it's often going to be accompanied with disbelief or even anger, which should be managed carefully. If not anger, there can be a move to defend the current practices and remain stubborn to the notion that change is actually required, and instead move to justify the systems that are in place. Now, it may not need to even be said, but defending the indefensible and justifying it is really not the best way to start a remediation program. It's part of the acceptance process, however, sometimes, and will eventually lead to the next stages. Now, once a group moves into acceptance, it's easier to begin tackling challenges being faced and to progress with the planning and the evaluation steps themselves. And using a solid risk-based approach and performing a risk assessment or perhaps multiple gap assessments, the groups can begin to form around the roles that they will each play and what impact they're each going to have on the remediation program itself. Now, putting the planning together and prioritizing all the work will also bring it into focus and allow the organization to take manageable bites out of the larger whole, which I like to call a phase-based approach, which is quite common for these types of programs. Next comes the actual execution, which again, it may take a significant amount of time, and everyone should be cognizant of personnel burnout and cycling key individuals or moving them away from other organizational work that may be important for the long-term success of focusing on the remediation program. And again, having a solid expert project manager will help in this regard, as they can more easily monitor everyone's progress and stress as the work fluctuates over time and as it ebbs and flows. Now, as phases are completed, a critical action not to forget about is your effectiveness program. It is imperative to set up SMART goals for your effectiveness program in order to not only ensure that the changes put in place will have immediate impact, but that over the long term, that they remain effective. And this will actually become a documented measure to show any future inspector that yes, you not only corrected those issues, but that they have stuck and they've become the new normal. And as a secondary avenue for checking effectiveness and overall health of the quality system, it's really good to have a fully functioning internal self-inspection program. This will help keep the organization within that perpetual state of readiness that I mentioned earlier by continuously testing the quality systems over time and providing it real-time feedback. Now, if you've designed your systems properly, this kind of feedback really is positive and is only going to add to the overall strength of those systems. Now, it's important to note that while we may assume that this is a clean process and go stepwise from one to the next, it can often jump around from one to another, both forward and backwards, depending on the availability of information at those times or when potentially new situations arise as the work itself develops. So remember that your remediation program is a living thing, and it's going to need the right people with the right expertise to make corrections the first time. So with that, let me bring this to a close. I can only hope that this high-level talk has shed some further light on both the soft skills as well as the functional needs for a systems-based approach for remediation that is supported from the top down with an eye on corporate culture paired with both collaboration and communication. I wish you all the best as you get back to your day, and I will now pass you over to our host who will begin the Q&A session. Thank you again.
Okay, thank you very much. It is now time for the Q&A. So a quick reminder to everyone how this works. Just type your question into the box in the top left-hand corner of your screen, click submit, and then wait to hear if your question's read aloud. As you've already had some come in, so let's just get started. Our first question today is, what if we received a warning letter due to repeat observations because of CAPAs were not out on time? Is that the same process?
Well, that is a good question, and I hesitate to say this answer, but it's really both yes and no. And let me qualify that before you groan a bit as a consultant giving that kind of answer. Yes, in that it is certainly going to take many of the same critical success factors, a similar approach to get through the remediation once it starts. It's going to have the same kinds of challenges and needs are going to have to be executed. And you're going to have some of the same challenges in terms of collaboration, culture, and communication for certain, and the actual embodiment and execution of the work is going to be very similar. The no portion of my answer would be that when you have repeat findings from a regulatory body, they tend to come with them an even higher sense of urgency and compressed timelines to demonstrate to that authority that you have a renewed commitment to quality, and you've put in place some really concrete steps to execute your action plan, and that improvements are being made in a fairly short period of time. And this, in turn, is going to provide a deeper sense of stress on the entire organization to get things done, and can sometimes be more difficult to maintain the ability to provide a deep thought-out strategy over using knee-jerk reactions. And in these cases, when you have repeat observations like this, it's in my opinion, it's an example of when an extremely knowledgeable project manager and subject matter expert really is going to be something that's absolutely invaluable to aid in bringing an informed external point of view to the overall response.
Okay, thank you very much. I've got another question here. Someone has asked, why can't we just fix items in remediation that may be short-term fixes, like quickly closing out overdue investigations? And then once clear from the oversight, we can fix them more thoroughly and look at the underlying systems then.
Well, that's an interesting concept, to be sure. While there may very well be some immediate actions taken as part of the response itself that are built upon the longer-term, more comprehensive solutions, that does not mean that those immediate corrections are bad or poorly thought out by any means. But I would say that providing what sound like to be potentially Band-Aid fixes or surface-only solutions on purpose, that tends to show bad returns on the actual overall investment, and there really are a poor way to proceed for a couple of reasons. First is simply put that embarking on something as critical as a program that impacts your quality systems, business continuity, and provides elevated regulatory risk with the intent to potentially, in a way, deceive the oversight process is not, in my opinion, what I would call best practice. It's also going to probably waste valuable resources to Band-Aid issues when they may have to be reworked a second time when you get serious about solving the problems identified. It's a different approach than really when you're building a foundation and then adding to it over time with both short and then long-term solutions. Another issue in regards to going back later, potentially, is one that I'm sure many folks on this call may be able to relate to, which is that at pretty much every company I've ever been to, resources are generally already fully engaged. Everybody's very busy, and I would expect that if you took a Band-Aid approach as your first go through, as soon as you felt that the scrutiny was removed in the short term, that the company's priorities would shift elsewhere, and you may never actually get the time or the money or the attention from those required to restart the process at a deeper level to make any further changes. And it further provides for poor behavior exhibition really to everybody else at the company that says, in effect, hey, we don't really need to change, and even though the inspectors tell us we have deficiencies, we're just going to choose to stay the course in regards to process and behavior rather than actually making meaningful change. And that's not exactly what I would say is the model of demonstrating commitment to change and that top-down approach that I had mentioned earlier. And I'll hazard to say that you're likely to fail in subsequent inspections, and in doing so, that outcome is really going to be disastrous, to say the least. You have to remember that the follow-up inspections can really happen at any time, and they're not on a predefined timeline. So you really just don't know, quote unquote, how much time you actually have in between visits. And certainly for these kinds of serious issues where you have repeat observations. And lastly, let me just say that inspectors are generally quite intelligent, and attempting to pass a poor change plan across as solid, sustainable work product is very likely to see increased enforcement in a very short period of time.
Okay, very good. So what are the systems that you mean when you talk about a systems-based approach?
Well, these are the 6 systems that are considered to be expected and really embody the needed parts of a highly functioning quality system. And keep in mind that within each one there are numerous subcategories, and there's going to be many procedural controls expected, within each system, and that actually make up each system. But at a very high level, they are quality systems, facilities and equipment systems, materials controls, production systems, packaging and labeling systems, and laboratory controls.
Okay, thanks again. So we've got another question here asking, how many people should be on an executive steering committee for a remediation project?
Well, I cannot say that there's a magic number needed for this type of group. It's really going to depend on each company and how they're structured. If, for instance, let's say it's a global group and the observation or corrective actions are impacting potentially multiple sites or require collaboration between, say, a corporate team that's in one location and a remote manufacturing site, you're going to need representatives from both locations and both groups to provide input and work through the challenges and the roadblocks along the way in order to make good choices that are not made in isolation, but with understanding and buy-in from everybody. That's part of the process. Now, if it's a small manufacturer with a single site, there might be less of a group that should be invited to that committee. But at a minimum, let me just say that there should be representatives at high level from each of the major areas of impact, such as quality assurance, certainly operations, finance, regulatory affairs, likely quality control, engineering and facilities, and potentially even HR. And so it's going to depend as well on the number and the scope of the observations themselves that come out of your inspection.
Okay, and we have a question here asking, if we only have 15 days to provide a response to an FDA 483 observation, how is it possible to employ a consultant within that time frame to help with the response and also get all of the strategy completed in time?
Well, I'll say that I never said that responding to a negative inspection outcome was going to be an easy task. But while it is a short period of time, certainly companies do manage to execute it on a relatively routine basis. Those first 15 days, however, really are very critical, and you need to treat it like there's really nothing else of higher priority for all of the engaged personnel, and it really is a all hands on deck, so to speak. And this includes any outside resources that you want to bring on board to help shape the response that you're going to put back. And I'll say again, I think I mentioned this earlier, but an outside eye looking in really will additionally provide the right kind of lens to ensure that your response provides an aggressive yet doable timeline for the corrections that you intend to put in place, and by that I mean both corrections to solve the issue, in the very short term, as well as what long-term additional actions or implementations are going to be used to provide further sustainable change. Not to mention that your response, there are certain templates and certain expectations for how it's going to be put together and what it's going to verbally sound like, and so having that outside eye looking in is certainly helpful. Now, in terms of how do you get someone you trust on site quickly enough, that's certainly a fair question, and I can say that only that from my personal experience that I've certainly been able to put subject matter experts on site within a day or so of the end of an inspection, whenever that's needed, and so you can be assured in this field that resources really are available at short notice. Beyond that, the world is a big place, but it's really not that big. Within a day's flight, somebody can be really anywhere on the world that's going to be needed. And beyond that, sometimes I recommend to folks that it's a good idea that you may already have a group in mind before the water starts to boil, so to speak, so that you have a relationship with contacts that you can trust ahead of time, and then you can simply call them when they're actually needed. And I can say that I have people call me, and we can respond in an expeditious manner when it's needed, and we can provide those kind of resources to our clients.
Okay, very good. Now I'm afraid that's all the time we have today, which just leaves a big thanks to Jesse for his great presentation, and of course to NSF International for sponsoring this session. To everyone watching, you will be receiving an email shortly letting you know how to access the on-demand version of this webinar, or you can always watch it through our website, which is www.business-review-webinars.com. We look forward to sharing further webinars with you, so please do keep an eye out on the website just mentioned. And follow us on Twitter at BR Daily Updates, and join our LinkedIn group, Business Review Webinars. Thank you all once again, and I hope everyone enjoys the rest of their day.